On July 31st, 1960, Russell Allen, a schoolteacher from Las Vegas, was visiting the desert with his family outside Congress, Arizona, in Sandwash Creek bed on Old Alamo Road. The man was looking for rocks for his garden when he stumbled upon something shocking, a small, partially buried body in the creek bed. The remains belonged to a female who had brown hair and fingernails that were painted red, and she was partially clothed. They were also charred, as if someone tried to burn evidence. Police found a pocket knife nearby, along with flip-flops that had been cut down to her size. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, no cause of death could be determined, but the manner of death was believed to be homicide. The first autopsy determined that she was Caucasian, between 5 to 7 years old, but later examinations indicated she may have been as old as 9 or as young as 2 at the time of her death, and the actual race was ruled as being indeterminable. When nobody came forward to claim the child's body, she became known as Little Miss Nobody. Locals pooled their money to give her a proper burial. She was buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Prescott, Arizona, in a pale blue casket. According to reports, more than 70 people attended her funeral, and a stark white marker reading Little Miss Nobody, Blessed are the Pure in Heart, was placed at the head of her grave. Among the several messages of condolences for Little Miss Nobody placed among the floral arrangements around her casket, one anonymous writer had written a note stating, "Forgive us, child, for the weakness of men, and in turn, when in your final home, pray for us." Within the eulogy that Dr. Charles Franklin Parker recited at the funeral, he predicted that the identity of this child would never be known. The case grew cold, though it was periodically re-examined through the years to see if it could be linked to the case of a 4-year-old little girl from New Mexico. Police in Arizona had heard about a missing girl in New Mexico, but they believed that their Jane Doe was 7 years old, not 4. Because of the assumed age discrepancy, investigators at first dismissed the idea that Little Miss Nobody was the missing 4-year-old from New Mexico, and because she went missing about 400 miles away. In 2018, the case was reopened and her remains were exhumed. Using a DNA profile, a sketch was released of what Little Miss Nobody may have looked like prior to her death. With that DNA profile, surviving family members of the girl that went missing in New Mexico were able to then submit their own DNA samples for comparison. But the technology in 2018 still wasn't advanced enough to link the family to the body. Othram received the case in December 2021, which was paid for by crowdfunding in about 1 day, and they were able to return the identity to authorities in February 2022. It took less than 2 months for them to determine her identity after 62 years of no one knowing for sure. Turns out that Little Miss Nobody actually was the missing 4-year-old girl from New Mexico, and her name was Sharon Lee Gallegos. Sharon was born September 6, 1955. She lived with her mother, Lupe Gallegos, her 2 older siblings, and her grandmother. Her father, a soldier, had left the family when Sharon was very young. 4-year-old Sharon was abducted from her grandmother's home in Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 21, 1960, 10 days before being found in Arizona. Sharon had been playing in an alley behind her house at 512 Virginia Avenue in Alamogordo. She was playing with her 2 cousins, ages 5 and 11. They said that a man and a woman drove up in a dirty old green car, possibly a dark green 1951 or 1952 Dodge or Plymouth. A woman described as short, heavy-set in her 30s with dirty blonde hair got out of the car. She offered to buy Sharon candy and new clothes if she would get in the car with them. When she refused, the woman dragged her in the vehicle and the man drove away, turning west onto 5th Street and disappearing. The driver was described as thin and fair-skinned, with a long nose and sandy-colored straight hair. Sharon's Aunt Beatrice was visiting and heard the commotion and ran out of the door to see the car speed away. The abduction was reported immediately, and within an hour, police set up roadblocks to try and catch the green car at the Texas-New Mexico state border, but their efforts were fruitless. Sharon's 11-year-old friend Dolores Badal told police that earlier that day, she and Sharon were walking when Sharon got scared and asked Dolores to carry her past a dark green car. The car was parked nearby, and a woman was inside staring at Sharon's house, the same woman and car that abducted her hours later. Dolores Badal's older sister, 16-year-old Mary Lou Badal, also informed investigators that shortly before the actual abduction, while she was standing in the kitchen doorway, she saw the female abductor sitting inside the vehicle, intently staring at the Gallegos residence. It is believed that the couple stalked Sharon for days or weeks leading up to the abduction. They had been seen after church the Sunday prior to her disappearance with 2 young children, a boy with freckles and a small girl in a car. Following the church service, the female abductor had asked several attendees probing questions pertaining to Sharon and Lupe. The woman knocked on a neighbor's door to ask about Lupe. She said she wanted to offer her a job and asked about her financial situation and whether she had a little girl and whether she had a lot of children. The children seen with her were not in the car the day the abduction happened. A friend and neighbor of the Gallegos family, Helen Gonzalez, also informed investigators she had observed a dark green vehicle matching the description provided by the eyewitnesses parked at the site of the abduction the previous Sunday. It's possible that the strange couple had tried to abduct Sharon before because she suddenly stopped wanting to go to the grocery store around the corner, which she had always enjoyed doing, and would become upset if she saw a green car. The family didn't have a lot of money, and Lupe worked as a motel maid. They had no telephone at the home, and no one ever contacted them with a ransom demand. When her body was found, her hair had been dyed auburn or reddish brown. Her toenails and fingernails had been painted, and her clothes had been changed. It's been speculated that the man may have been Sharon's biological father that abandoned her and Lupe, but we may never know. Her mother, Lupe, died in 2011 at the age of 87 of natural causes. It's strange to think that the woman that took her appeared to be in her 30s, and she could possibly be alive today in her 90s. Thankfully, she has her identity back, but as of today, her abductors remain unknown. On December 8, 1982, divers were searching in the Escatawpa River in Moss Point, Mississippi. The divers had just recovered the body of a toddler days earlier who would become known as Mississippi Delta Dawn. The little Jane Doe would go unidentified for 38 years until December 2020, when she was finally identified as Alicia Ann Heinrich. While searching the river following her recovery, the divers happened to come across skeletal remains about 60 yards away. Although the remains for both victims were found within days of one another, investigators later determined that their deaths were not related, but both were indeed homicide victims. The second victim became known as Moss Point John Doe and had died of a gunshot wound. It was determined that his death was somewhere between 1979 and 1982, 6 months to 3 years prior to being found on the banks of the river. Investigators believe the young man's body ended up there after being thrown from the bridge. A forensic artist, Katiana Falsetti of Gainesville, Florida, would later create an image of what he may have looked like in life. Unable to determine his identity and no one coming forward to claim him, he became known as Moss Point John Doe for the next 40 years. Using funding provided by philanthropist and genealogist Carla Davis, investigators teamed up with Othram. As usual, Othram used forensic-grade genome sequencing and genealogical research to identify a close relative of the young man. The genealogy research led to a possible match to the victim. Investigators reached out to the family of the possible match and were able to obtain a DNA sample. After testing the relative's DNA, Othram confirmed that the relative was a biological sibling of the young man. Now, nearly 40 years later, the John Doe has been identified as Gary Simpson. Gary was born in 1962 and was originally from the Louisiana area. There is also very little information available about Gary at this time. On April 24, 1995, human remains were discovered partially buried near Route 66 and Highway 281 in Caddo County, Oklahoma. Over a year later, on September 2, 1996, more of the same person's remains were found about a mile away. It was determined she was likely between the ages of 16 and 25 years old. Whoever killed her purposely made it very difficult to identify her by removing any identifying features. Unable to determine her identity, she became known as Caddo County Jane Doe for the next 27 years. In March 2021, the Jane Doe's DNA was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon submitted results back to investigators with possible genetic matches 5 months later. Agents then contacted possible relatives requesting DNA samples to compare to the possible match. The comparisons were a match, and it was announced in March 2022 that the remains were those of 20-year-old Katrina K. Benevania. Her parents divorced the year after she was born, and then her mother died in 1979 when Katrina was only 5. She was originally from Colorado and arrived in Oklahoma in the summer of 1993. A few months later, she married Charles Basil Benevania, and the couple had a son that was born in May of 1994. There is very little available at this time about Katrina. The question remains whether her husband ever attempted to report her missing and if he had any involvement. It's unknown if anyone ever reported her missing, but Katrina was not listed as a missing person in NamUs or any other databases for missing persons. Her unidentified remains were listed on the Doe network along with a reconstruction. Her husband filed for divorce in March 1995, over a month before her remains were found. Some speculate that she was the victim of serial killer Cache Roadkiller, but his victims had a different background and he had a different MO. Although it took nearly 3 decades, her son and loved ones now hopefully have some closure. On July 7, 2001, human remains were found in Las Vegas, Nevada, near the I-15 and US 93, near Apex Road, in a remote area about 22 miles northeast of the Las Vegas Valley. Following an autopsy, the medical examiner ruled he died from blunt force trauma. It was determined that he was a white male, likely between 35 and 45 years of age. With all leads exhausted, the case soon went cold and he became known as Tortoise Reserve Doe. 20 years later, in October 2021, authorities in Las Vegas began working with Othram to reanalyze the skeletal remains to generate new leads that might identify the homicide victim or at least identify a close family relative using funds provided completely by AudioChuck. Skeletal remains were sent to Othram and a DNA extract was produced. From the extract, a genealogy profile was generated using forensic-grade genome sequencing. Genetic genealogists with Othram then used the profile to attempt to identify distant relatives that could help trace the identity of the victim. Othram then gave the names of 2 potential relatives of the victim to detectives who then made contact with potential family members. In February 2022, DNA confirmed a biological sister to the victim. The John Doe's name was Richard Wayne Guerrero. At the age of 39, Richard left home in Florida and traveled to Las Vegas and spent a week in a strip motel. He was scheduled to return home November 18, 1996, and he last spoke to his family a week prior, letting them know of his plans. He never returned, and his family never heard from him again, but they did report him missing when he didn't come home. His remains were found nearly 5 years after he went missing. An active investigation into his homicide continues, and there is no further information available on Richard at this time. In May 1978, human remains were found in Cadiz County, Washington, near Westside Road, between Nelson and Cle Elum. Authorities sent the remains to Central Washington University's Anthropology Department, and Dr. James Alexander initially believed the remains belonged to a female in her 30s or 40s and were found 3 to 9 months after her death. In the early 2000s, a DNA sample of the remains did not match any records in the DNA databases at the time, but were passed along to the King County Medical Examiner. Sometime later, Washington's forensic pathologist Dr. Kathy Taylor, who passed away in August 2021, sent a sample to the University of North Texas Health Center lab. There was no match, but a DNA analysis revealed the victim was a man, not a woman, as originally believed. In 2020, Caddo County Coroner Nick Henderson submitted this same DNA sample for comparison in a forensic genealogy database, and months later, in December 2021, a possible sibling of the victim was identified. It was then confirmed that the remains belonged to Donald Grant Anderson, who had been missing since 1977. According to family members, Donald was originally from Minnesota and had been in Washington state a short time prior to being reported as a missing person in 1977. The Caddo County Sheriff's Office is continuing their investigation into Donald's death. Although not much information is publicly known about him as of today, at least he has his name back after 4 decades.